Hey, and welcome back to the channel. So we have been following the Virtual Doll Convention and their monthly subscription boxes for Grace Marie Fitzpatrick. So for the month of December, we're not in September, for the month of December, they decided to go back to the 1840s to Victorian London with Charles Dickens. And the outfit of the month featured a plaid two-piece dress with a skirt and a top, and the top buttons all the way up the front with small black buttons, and then it has a lace kind of collar on the dress as well. And I believe it came with a petticoat. And then to accent this outfit, they had a kind of cape overcoat for the dress. So some of the things that I wanted to look into for the 1840s, we're going to talk about the different dolls that were around in the 1840s, because as I had said in a previous video, I feel like dolls kind of are a window into what was going on, just like how now we see different dolls and fashion dolls dressed in things that have to do with the time period that we're in now. So we're going to look at the 1840s, and we're going to look at my favorite part, what was going on in the world in Europe and now America as its own entity and not just a colony. We're going to look at some of the dresses and the silhouettes, some of the underpinnings and things that you would find underneath these outfits to give them structure, as well as different accessories and a day wear versus evening wear, because we still have day versus night in every day going on. And then we're also going to look at what I created for Grace Marie Fitzpatrick for the 1840 style, as well as some other dolls and things from the time period to kind of get a better cohesive look of what was going on in the world of fashion and dolls. So my favorite part, what was going on in the world? So fashion is always a direct reflection of what is going on in the world. So we have Europe and America. This was an age of revolution. We had a lot of things going on in Europe and a lot of things that were going on in the newly founded America. So in Europe in the 1840s, this was an intense time of political change. We're seeing across the board, England, France, Spain, a lot of things have been going on previously from when we first kind of looked at the 1760s. Fast forward now, almost 100 years later, a lot of the monarchies and things are no longer in session, and they're being replaced by governments. And there's been a lot of revolution and a lot of wars going on. The 1848 revolutions, they were fueled by the demand for a political reform and a social justice. And all of this unrest in the high society, Europe still kind of remained firmly rooted in a life of luxury, and their fashions kind of continued to be both lavish and flamboyant, whereas you're trying to represent how much money you have and your personal status and your personal identity more so than your personal identity as it refers to titles and the wealth that you're given and the status that you have in the world, versus like, I'm wearing this because I like this, or I'm wearing this because it reflects the things that I like. That was kind of your European fashion. And then, of course, in Europe, the most iconic fashion symbol that you could follow in the time was Queen Victoria in Britain. So a lot of this began when she first came into power in 1837, and her influence was felt widely across Europe. She had a very modest reflection when it came to her fashion ideals, and her style, some said, became the epitome of grace. She had simple and modest dresses, and they kind of reflected the Victorian values that were going on in society at that time. Her wedding dress in 1840 was all the rage. It was very simple, and it kind of reflected purity and moral fortitude, which in the very beginning of the Victorian era, that was women's role in society. Women went from these highly flamboyant kind of things to now they are housemakers, and they're taking more of a role of being modest, and you're a wife and you keep a house, and a lot of the lavish type things that were going on kind of strewed away. Like, you wanted to hide everything. Like, everything was being a little bit more modest than we had seen in previous fashions moving forward. And Queen Victoria's reach even spread over into Western fashion. And a lot of people wanted to follow what the queen was doing and what the queen was wearing and what her court was wearing. And then in Italy and Spain, some of the fashion was also mirrored by your aristocratic ideals. Women were still wearing what some might say the scrumptious and luxurious fabrics like silks and velvets and satins. And even during the economic changes and the reforms of this time period, fashion remained a very important aspect of your wealthy lifestyle and kind of displayed how wealthy you were and like what you could do. Now, move across the ocean, we're going to America, who, when we last spoke in the 1760s, was a colony. Well, now they are not a colony. They are the United States of America. And crossing this Atlantic, this was also a period of dramatic change, but it wasn't a dramatic change from royalty. This was the expansion of the United States and the manifest destiny and the rise of the middle class. So we've seen a lot of settlers come in, a lot of people that are moving away from these wars and revolutions across the pond. And so now they're coming to the United States and they want this newfound world of riches and they want a piece of their freedom moving here. And so the nation's destiny, or they said it was the nation's destiny, but the whole point moving into the 1840s, and everybody wanted to expand westward. So we're going to see these were the times moving into the Oregon Trail, going into the California Gold Rush. Everybody wanted to move westward into this uncharted land and uncharted territory so they could carve out a small piece for themselves and make a name for themselves and be, you know, this is where the whole American ideal started to come in. So you're kind of looking at more of a utilitarian focus. You're not going to see somebody traveling across the prairies and across the plains in pure silks and brocades. Maybe they would have had a nice silk dress or a nice cotton blend silk dress, but you're going to see things that have more of a, you know, especially in the rural areas, a utilitarian effect to them. And it's still suited for fashion and it still has to be practical, but a lot of the silhouettes and things for the American dresses, they were more of a cotton and a wool and a linen because the climate is kind of different in America than it is in Europe. And it's a lot of, again, what you can get. Things are still coming in on ships. Things are still being traded and bartered. Some things are being made in the United States. And that is more or less the cotton and wool linen. And that is definitely reflected in the lifestyles. You see the pioneers. Hemlines are definitely a little bit shorter because you're walking around in dirt and different things like that while you're traveling. Some of the cities are very developed when you're talking New York and Boston and Philadelphia. All of these cities that kind of are the cornerstone of the United States are very built up and very reflective of the new and upcoming things. But when we're talking manifest destiny and expanding out to the west towards California and Kansas and Montana, even to Texas, some of these were just territories and people didn't really know what was going on. They just knew that they wanted the American dream and they wanted to carve out a chunk of land for themselves. So it was definitely very different. And the evening wear was very different, where in Europe you probably had lavish balls in the evening wear and you would slip from your very modest cotton day dress that probably had a higher neckline to something where you would go to a ball or have a dinner. And they were similar in the design, but again, the fabrics were a little bit different. This might be someplace where more of an aristocratic, well-to-do person would be wearing a silk outfit, but again, a lot simpler, a little bit more toned down when it came to fashion. And that kind of, in a nutshell, is what it was. You know, we're experiencing a lot of different things in Europe and a lot of different things in America. However, the fashion ideals and the fashion norms are still very much the same, no matter what side of the pond you're on. So with that being said, let's kind of take a look at what some of the dresses and the silhouettes would have looked like in the 1840s. So it's a very different silhouette, and as we kind of touched on before, modesty was the thing. And while the early part of the decade was still influenced by certain aspects in the 1830s. You saw really big puffy sleeves and almost a Regency style look where the bodice is very narrow and straight down. We're going to move into the 1840s where things are changing, and the Gothic revival and Romanticism are kind of heavy influenced, and what people are kind of looking at, again, it was a dramatic shift, and it's the last part of the Romantic era and the very beginning of the Victorian era. So we're talking about clothing reflecting society's ideals of women. Women were supposed to be very modest and very genteel. And so you were going to see things in the daytime like a higher neckline. You saw them kind of an off the shoulder scoop. The bodices were very fitted and weren't meant for a lot of moving and a lot of activity. So you'll see almost a yoke neckline in these bodices, and you'll see what they call a fan front bodice. So it's gathered at the waist, and the waist of the bodices almost always came to a V shape or a point. Now there are exceptions to the rule. There are some that have more of a straight waistline that are gathered in the middle and then kind of either tucked or pleated and folded in the front. And then you have the sleeves. The sleeves, I think, for the 1840s are a dead giveaway when you're looking at the daguerreotype photos, the black and white photos of the 1840s, because they're almost in a yoke neckline, and the shoulder seams are placed very far out to the shoulders. Almost so, in almost everything that I've read, it said that women couldn't raise their hands above their head because they were restricted by the way the arm's eye and the shoulders went. But it was because women weren't really doing much to be moving around and needing to move their arms, in the 1840s. So the sleeves were not puffy at all. They were very straight and narrow sleeves. Oftentimes they would be decorated with a ruffle. If you had an evening gown, it was more of a lower cut bodice line, and you would have some ruffles or gathers at the sleeve. But for the most part, most of the sleeves were very narrow. And a lot of the lace and frills and different things like that were taken out. And you just saw a lot of textile decoration. So we saw a lot of piping, which is you run a little bit of cording through some fabric and it leaves kind of like a raised bump. So you would see piping on the bodices, you would see piping on the shoulders, you would see a lot of pleats and ruffles and tucks in the same fabrics. And these pleats and ruffles kind of added a little bit of texture to the garment and a little bit of interest, especially to those that were just a plain linen or wool. You also saw a lot of printed fabrics and a lot of plaids. Plaids were usually very bold and bright in color, and the different stripes and patterns were always cut in an interesting way or cut on the bias of a fabric, if you are familiar with sewing terminology. And they use these different designs to create additional designs on whole bolts of fabric to kind of make these dresses a little bit more intricate and a little bit more interesting. Let's see, as we were talking about, the sleeves are narrow. They ended at the wrist, and as we move into the later 1840s, they start to kind of bell out and get ready for that 1850s pagoda sleeve or a sleeve insert where you kind of see them balloon out a little bit more. But like I said, 1840s, a telltale sign is the arm's eye at the top and a tight narrow sleeve. The ensembles that go underneath. So we still are living in an era of a corset. The corsets are still, they give kind of an unnatural silhouette. They come up to the bust area, so probably starting right about here, and then they move down over the hips. And this gives you kind of like a slender, non-busty type look. There was a lot of boning channels, which if you watch any other videos about corseting, it's small little channels that go through this garment, and a lot of that is to help support the outfit and give you that sleek, structured silhouette. And once you had your corset on, you again would have a petticoat. Now, depending on where you lived, depended on how many different layers. We haven't reached the era of the hoop skirt or a cage crinoline or anything like that. Most of the silhouettes in the 1830s and 1840s were brought on just by layering up petticoats. Now, the fuller your skirt is generally means the more fabric you had and the more petticoats you piled on. And in the winter, you would sometimes have a quilted petticoat that was a little bit heavier, meant to keep in the warmth. And then you had your general plain cotton petticoat with, you know, a lace ruffle or some pin tucks on top of that. And then you always had your chemise. Drawers were also popular. The split drawers, which is literally what its name is. It's like the pantaloons, but they have a split up the middle and the back side so that you could use the restroom while you have all of these massive amounts of petticoats on, because you're not getting fully undressed to go to the bathroom, and they don't have running bathrooms. You're going literally to an outhouse or using a chamber pot when you're using the restroom for women. Moving into the accessories. Some of my favorite things for the accessories are the bonnets. You're going to see a lot of the bonnets have almost like a cone shape because modesty was such a high value. They didn't want people ogling at you when you went out and about with people. So the bonnets, from a side point of view, like you weren't supposed to see a person's face. Now, as you moved from the 1840s into the 1850s, the bonnets kind of like opened up a little bit more, but you would see them, different designs, different ruchings and gatherings. There was straw bonnets, bonnets covered in silk. They were all one color. Some bonnets were plaid. Some were decorated with lots of flowers, lots of flamboyant ribbons with pleats and tucks and folds. Very decorated. But this was, when you went outside, kind of a way to show off, because the hairstyle was literally a part down the middle, and sometimes there would be a braid swoop that went over your ear, and then everything was pulled back into a tight bun. There was no flounces or poofs or anything like that. It was very simple, sleek for the day wear. And then when you dressed up towards the evening, a lot of times they would do the little sausage curls on the side, and that would be your fancier dress. But hairstyles definitely took a tone back and were a lot more modest in the 1840s. Again, with the modesty, when you went out, you always wanted something to cover up. So you would wear a cape or a shawl. There was some things called pelerins. So if it was like too warm outside to really wear a shawl or that added bulk, it was a pelerin, which was almost the same fabric or the same shade of fabric that looked like a built-in shawl that you would wear when you went outside, because you, one, wanted your head to be covered when you went outside, and you also wanted this chest area to be covered when you went out as well. For jewelry, there wasn't a lot of jewelry. A lot of the different things that they had were fitted gloves. Again, most of these were made out of kid leather. You always wore gloves when you went outside and when you went to social events. Sometimes in the evening, they would be traded for a lace or almost like a neck glove. And then jewelry. Jewelry in some aspects were ornate. Many women had brooches and lockets that they kind of wore. There was some gold, but still gold in different jewels was like a finery. So if you were wearing all of these extravagant jewels, you had a standing in society. And for the most part, when you're moving westward into America, you had smaller things like lockets and small dainty necklaces, a wedding ring or a wedding band, maybe a bracelet, things like that. But it wasn't the big glitzy, glamoury jewelry that you would see in Europe. And there wasn't a lot of jewelry being worn because, again, you have a high neckline, so there's not a lot of room for jewelry during the daytime. So you stuck to pins and brooches. We touched on the bonnets, the shoes. A lot of people think of Victorian era shoes where it's a white boot with buttons up the side. That's more towards your Edwardian period, not necessarily Victorian period. We're still looking at, yes, there were some boots, but we're still looking at almost a slipper type shoe. So some of these slippers were flat, some of them had leather, some were made of satin, but we're still looking at a fairly flat foot or flat shoe and maybe a heel. Some of the boots, I guess, would resemble what we wear now as people call booties, but they're still very flat. There's not a big arch in the heel. We're not looking to add a lot of height to things. Fairly simple slipper type shoe. And that's kind of what you know, overall the different things were made of. So not much changes in Europe versus America except for what your outfits are made of. So before we start talking about the dolls and the different things that were going on with that during the 1840s, I wanted to show my example of what Grace is wearing for the 1840s. So here she is in just a simple, almost like a cotton linen type dress, and it's green and it's just has a simple hem on it. It's actually a little bit long. I used enough fabric that because the scale is so small, she doesn't really need a petticoat. But I have her with her cape, and it's lined in almost a satin, and she is wearing this out to go caroling. And then this is my attempt at trying to do a fan front bodice, but on a 16-inch scale, it's a little difficult to kind of get everything together. Maybe if I did it again. And her neckline is a little bit low for the 1840s. It would probably need to kind of scoop more up this way to be historically accurate. And then these are her narrow sleeves that end at the end of the arm, and then we just have a small little ruffle as a little decoration for her. And then the next thing that we wanted to kind of highlight was the bonnet. Now, her bonnet isn't 100% historically accurate because it probably would have come out like a little bit more towards her face, like maybe an inch or so out this way. But she's got a pleated ribbon, and we had to kind of sew this. I had to kind of sew it almost all by hand because it's so small and you can't really put it on a sewing machine. But she's got a pleated black ribbon with a lace that kind of lines up the top, and then it's the same kind of design on the other side, and then it ties here at the bottom. And then let's see if we can slip her off. If you can kind of see in between here, I even styled Grace's hair with the loose braids that kind of loop to the sides. But this was my take on the 1840s with Grace Marie Fitzpatrick and her dress with her cape. So she would be very society driven, I guess. You know, I see her very much a character in the Christmas Carol, and I think that she would fit right in. So when we're talking about the dolls in the 1840s, still a lot of them are made out of wax, paper mache. You see cloth dolls if you're moving towards the frontier. And then again, we're seeing some of the similar styles. You do start to see the China heads pop in, and again, China heads were a little bit more expensive. And usually if little girls had a China head doll, they had one or two, and you mostly saw them in a smaller size. They had the China head with either a lambskin body or a kid leather body, or a kind of like a linen-y type material, and they were usually stuffed with sawdust, not cotton, like how we see dolls and things stuffed today. So again, one of my favorite books is the Thorold auction books, and in this one there's a couple of pictures and examples. It's kind of hard to see with the lighting on it, but this is the hairstyles that we're kind of talking about. And these are probably meant to be more of an evening wear bodice. I believe these dolls are paper mache, but you can see the fan front pleating. And then this is probably moving into the late 1840s, 1850s, because we're starting to see the sleeves kind of bellow out a little bit more. Let's see what else we got in here. And then these ones are also from the same book, but this one again kind of shows just the shawl and how it kind of comes in. You can see a very simple dress. These look like if they may be leather. And then here is a really, she's more of a China head type doll with a very pretty bonnet. So these were kind of the dolls, you know, 1840s, what we were kind of looking at as far as what little girls would have had. the china heads kind of changed, and as you moved, the hairstyles kind of changed. Jenny Lind became very popular, and you started to see the Jenny Lind dolls and more of your Parian type porcelain dolls or bisque dolls. And that's kind of it for what it would look like moving forward with some of the dolls. So that's kind of it. That's a wrap, and that's what we're kind of looking at for the world of the 1840s. We're looking at a little bit more simpler and modest time, a lot of revolution and manifest destiny going on both in Europe and America, and this reflects the values and silhouettes of the time period when it comes to women and what they wore. So this has been fun. I really enjoyed deep diving into the 1840s. I didn't hit nearly on everything. Like I said, I am no subject matter expert. I'm not a historian. This is just something that I find very interesting. So please let me know what some of your favorite 1840 styles are, or what you thought of the different doll 1840 styles, or if you're a collector of dolls of that time period, because I know there are several people out there who have a lot of very nice models of dolls from, 1840s to 1850s. So I'm really curious. But thank you all for watching, and stay tuned because we'll be taking a deep dive into the next era when the virtual doll convention comes out with their January theme for Grace Fitzpatrick. Bye guys.